Welcome to my studio. Today's painting is of coneflowers and bees. My name's Elizabeth Bostick, and I am so happy to have you with me today to create this beautiful watercolor. For the paper today, I'm using 140-pound cold-pressed 100% cotton paper that's in this cute little sketchbook. I don't know how to pronounce the name of the manufacturer of the sketchbook, so I will add that in the text above. After drawing the initial sketch of the coneflowers, which you can find in the description of the video if you would like to trace and paint along, I used my kneaded eraser to lighten up the pencil lines, and then using my number 6 round watercolor brush, I put 8 dots of the magenta rose watercolor and then rinse out my brush, and using just water on the brush, make the shape of the petal, and the paint follows the water to create this beautiful wet on wet watercolor effect. I do that for each petal, rinsing out the brush. If the pink is getting a little bit too intense on the brush, you wash out your brush so it's just water on the brush again and go on to the next petal. You can go back in and play with the paint a little bit, adding a little bit more water or moving it around a little bit to get it how you would like it to be. And you can see that on the left-hand side of the sketchbook, I have my ceramic palette, and that is where I have my washes of watercolor that I will be using later on in the painting. For the next coneflower, I do the same thing. Rinse off your brush so you have just water on your watercolor brush, and then make the shape of the petal in water, and when that water hits the little dab of paint, the paint will flow into the water and make that really neat effect. The next step is for the interior, the cone of the coneflower, the center part of it. For that, I use a purple first, and here I'm making a lighter wash of the purple where I'm adding just a few brushfuls of water and a little bit of purple, mixing it up. So I start with dabs of the purple in both coneflowers, so this will be your first layer of color for the cone of the coneflowers. Some of the dabs touch the petals, and then you can see the color flowing into the color of the petals just a little bit, and I really like that effect. For the second layer of the cone and the coneflower, I'm using the same color as the petals, which is the magenta rose. And then after the magenta rose, I'm using a cadmium red, which is more of a brighter red, and that is the third layer of the cone. So now I have my red down, rinsing out my brush, and I'm going to be using the yellow, which is a cadmium deep yellow or a cadmium yellow light. Either one will work. And that is the final layer of the coneflowers. And this gives it a sunlit effect, as if the sun is shining on the flowers, and it gives it that glowing sunlit look. The yellow is touching the red in places, so you can see the colors blending together a bit, and I love that effect as well. For the third and fourth coneflowers, I'm doing them the same way, putting down 8 dots of color, rinsing off my brush, and then using the water to form the shape of the petals so that the paint flows into the water shape of the petals. And then the cones, I'm doing the same way, where you have first your purple, and then your magenta, then your red, and then your yellow for the center, for the cone of the coneflowers. On the top coneflower, you can see where the paint has dried and it made a little bit of a line where I didn't want it. And so what I'm doing is using just water on my brush softening up that line and then using a paper towel to soak some of that paint up and giving it a bit of a lighter look. The coneflowers that are still in the process of blooming, I'm using that same magenta rose color, and I'm making very thin petals, kind of in a basket shape, where you have some in the front, some on the side, some in the back, and I do the same thing for the next partially open coneflower. If you want to follow the outline that I did for these, I do have that in the description listed below. You can download it and then print it and trace it, or excuse me, or you can freehand it. Either way, I think it might look a little bit intimidating, but once you practice it a little bit, maybe on a scrap piece of paper, you'll get the hang of it in no time. It kind of reminds me of those hard plastic basket weaving projects maybe some of you had as a kid, where you go in and out of the spokes with the yarn. But it just happens to be the way these coneflowers look when they're partially blooming, and I thought they were a fun shape, so I wanted to add them. Next, for adding a little bit of interest to them, I'm using some quinacridone violet. It doesn't really matter what kind of violet you use, that's just the one I happen to have. And two of these partially bloomed coneflowers are still wet enough where you can see I'm charging the still wet color with that quinacridone violet, and it's blending nicely into it. But the third one on the top left-hand corner was too dry, so you can see more of a harder drying line. So for the stems, the color green that I'm using is a combination of emerald green and burnt sienna. I find this gives a rich botanical green that I really love. To figure out where your stems are going, or where they're going to go, where you need to paint them in, I like to use my brushes to kind of give a guideline and figure out what would look best. For this stem, I'm using the same combination of emerald green and burnt sienna. For the shadow right underneath the flower, to make it look like the sunshine is hitting the flower and there's a bit of shadow underneath it, I'm mixing ultramarine blue in with that green that I'd already mixed. That was the emerald green and the burnt sienna. If you don't have burnt sienna or emerald green, if you have a warm green, that will work, or even a cooler green would work for this as well. And then for your shadows, you can add a blue to that green and it will make a darker hue of green for you. So here I have added just a bit more to it, and then I've decided to take it away with a paper towel as it was just a little bit too dark. That is one nice thing about watercolor, is you can always, or you can usually, take away from the paint that you put down if you put too much down with a paper towel or a cloth. And right here, I'm taking some of the paint that I put down with the brush. If you dry off your brush, you can use it as a sponge and pick up some of the color with the brush that you've put down. For this next coneflower, I'm using that same combination of emerald green and burnt sienna, and then the mix of the turquoise blue, or sorry, the ultramarine blue with that green for the shadow. For this next stem, I'm putting down water first. You don't need to do that. I just happen to have a wet brush, and I was trying to figure out if that's really where I wanted the stem. So I laid down a line of water along the line first, and then added that same mixture of emerald green and burnt umber for the green, and then that same ultramarine blue at the very top to give it more depth, and then at the bottom of the stem as well. That way it looks like the sunlight is hitting the flowers, and there's a bit of shadow underneath the flowers and a bit of shadow towards the base of the stem as well. Then I'm adding more color to the coneflower stem that I've already done, as I'm wanting it to stand out a bit more and have a bit more weight in the foreground of the painting, and match the one next to it that's also in the foreground of the painting. For the partially bloomed coneflower to the top right part of the painting, I'm adding a little bit of violet to the inside of it as I'm playing with some shadow, perhaps trying to give it a little bit more interest to the painting. And then I'm putting in some red into that violet as well. Now that the coneflowers are complete, and I think they look gorgeous, I'm so happy with them, we are moving towards the bees. For the bees, I looked at pictures of those fluffy, adorable bumblebees. And to make the color yellow, I'm using a combination of yellows, but I think that the cadmium yellow light is pretty much the perfect yellow to use for these bees to start off with. So what I am doing is making 3 little puddles of yellow. It's a lot easier than it looks once you get the hang of it. I would practice it on a little scrap piece of paper first before putting it into your painting. I think this is probably like the 10th and 11th bee that I painted to practice for this. I did a little bit of experimentation first. So I make 3 puddles of yellow, the top being the thinnest, the middle being the fattest, and the little fuzzy bottom being a little bit smaller than the middle, but not as small as the head. For the second bee, I do it the same way, where the top puddle of yellow is the smallest. It's a bit thin. The middle is nice, round little fluffy ball, and then their little fuzzy bottom is a little bit smaller than the middle puddle of yellow. Once you have your 3 puddles of yellow, don't put them too far apart. Put them as close together or even closer than I have in my painting. You'll want to wait for it to completely dry before going in with, you can use a Payne's Gray, you can use a watered down black. You can make your own black by mixing maybe your purple and brown together. To make a black or a really dark color, you can mix a red, a blue, and a yellow together. For this one, I used the black that came with the set, which I watered down a little bit. You can see on the left-hand upper side of the screen that I have the black watered down to a bit of a thicker wash so that I'm not going directly onto the bee with the really thick, pure black paint, but I'm watering it down so that I can have a bit more shades of the black. So for the bee's head, that is the kind of a rounded half moon maybe shape with the black. And then the second area of black, I just filled in the area between the 2 yellow, the 2 first yellow blobs. And then for the third area of black, I'm filling in the area between those next 2 little yellow blobs and making sure that the bee is in a bit of a crescent shape, as that is what I was going for with these 2 bees. And then for the legs, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm using a size 0 or a size 2 round brush for details. Either one will work, whatever brush that you have that has the tiniest tip. I would use that for these details. For the antenna, I just did 2 little tiny swoops using the very tip of the brush. And then for the wings, I did a bit thicker line on the top of it where it has more of the pigment in that line. And then I created a lighter, more watered down shade of this black for the other part of the wing that comes down. The hardest part for me for these wings was making sure that I did not use too much pigment, that I was keeping them as light as I needed to be to look like they were insect wings. With watercolor, it's really easy to go darker or heavier in the paint. And one thing to remember with watercolor is to err on the side of lighter and more watered down, because you can always go back and make it darker, but sometimes it's difficult to pick that color back up with a paper towel and make it as light as you need it to be, especially if you're working with purples or blacks like we are here. For the second bee's wing, I did it in the same way, where the top line is a bit more intense of a black. There's a bit more pigment into that top line of the wing, that top swoop. And then the wing itself, I kept going back and lightening it up more and more with the paper towel, as I wanted to make sure it was a very, very light shade of gray. Then with the first bee that we worked on, I'm adding a bit of a darker part of wing, as if it's the second wing on the bee that's showing just a little bit underneath that first wing. And then going into the paper towel again, lightening it back up. And then putting in a bit of a darker black to where I thought the eye may be on the bee. Not necessary, I just like putting in the eye. The layings are just the tiniest little swoops of color, just really thin little lines. I tried to make them look a bit wavy, so they weren't just these, straight sticks poking out of the bees, but little wavy lines so that they looked like bee legs. And then again with that antenna, just the very teeny tiny tip of that brush, making two very thin antennae. And then putting in a little bit more of that black wash to make it look like there's a bit of shading on the bee, just on the underside of the bees. And then for a bit of shading or added detail to the yellow portion of the bees, I'm adding a bit of darker yellow. You can use orange. I believe I'm using the cadmium orange and yellow mixed together, but you can use a watered down orange or a darker yellow just to give it a bit of 3-dimension to the bee. Just a little bit of shading on the bees' bellies or the undersides of the bees. Then I go in with a little bit more orange, as the first layer didn't really show up a lot, so I'm just dabbing in and charging that color with just a little bit more of that orange. For the second bee, I'm going ahead and putting in the second wing. I thought it looked like we were seeing more of the back of the bee. Even though this bee is just from my imagination, I thought that it would look more correct, I guess, or it would look better if you could see the second wing as well. So again, I just did the thicker line and then the very light wash of gray. I think this is a good stopping point. I just love this painting of coneflowers and bees. I hope that you get a chance to create your own coneflower and bee painting. If you do, please let me know. I would love to hear about it. If you have any tips for me, please share them. And if you have any questions, please comment below. I hope to see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Hey everyone, welcome to my studio. My name is Elizabeth Bostic, and I am so excited to be painting a loose watercolor floral with you today. The brush that I'm using today is the number 6 round brush. And the paper that I have for today is the Arches or Arche paper, 140-pound cold pressed. For the first color, I dip my paintbrush in the water and then blot the water on a paper towel, and then pick up as much paint as I can as the brush will hold so that the tip is nice and saturated with the paint. I'm using a pretty red, it's called Madder Rose, but you can use any red or pink or purple that you want your rose color to be, maybe even an orange. For the first few strokes on the paper, I'm doing little tiny squiggles and keeping the paint nice and thick and rich. So I'm going back into the paint to make sure that there's a lot of pigment, a lot of paint on my brush. And I'm starting with those inner tight little petals with a lot of pigment, a lot of paint on the brush. For the next step, I'm going to be rinsing out some of the paint from the brush and putting my wet brush directly onto the paper at an angle so that the petals will get wider and wider. The brush that I'm using, the number 6 brush, is a little bit thin for this, but it's one that I feel comfortable using on such a small, in such a small area with such a small painting. But if you have a larger brush that you're comfortable using, it is much easier to get those thicker petals. So again, after doing the initial smaller interior petals, you are rinsing a little bit of the paint off of your brush and then touching that wet brush to the already painted thinner lines of the interior petals, and then bringing that petal out to make a thicker petal. And then as you go, you're adding more and more water to your brush. So you're rinsing out more of the paint, so it's more water and less paint that is on your brush. And when you touch it to the petals that are already down that have more paint, that paint spreads into the lighter wash. It spreads into the new petals that you're painting, and it's giving them some more of that pink or red color. So as you extend your petals out, as you add more and more petals, you want them to be fatter and fatter, wider and wider. And if you lose so much of the paint on your brush that it's just clear watercolor, you can then go in and add some more paint to your watercolor. But before you do that, you want to make a light wash so that the paint that you're adding isn't that intense, rich paint. It's a very watered down wash of the color. To make the wash, I add about 4 brushfuls of water, and then the Madder Rose that I'm using to paint the rose with. A couple more brushfuls of water, mix it up well, and then test that color onto my little scrap paper just to make sure that I like the strength of the color, that I like that value, and then add it right into the rose. Looking at the rose, I thought it didn't quite look balanced enough, so I'm adding 1 more petal, and it kind of gives it more of a circular form, but with the petals creating the organic rose shape. And that feels more balanced to me. Next, I'm going to mix the green that I will start with for the background. You can use any green that you would like. The green that I used from this set is called just green, and it's the PG8 that I then mixed with a little bit of the cadmium deep yellow and the sepia. This created a more muted green that had matched the look that I was going for. For the design, I referenced my practice rose, and I really liked the way the greenery swooped around. On the top, it swooped up to the left, and on the bottom, it also swooped down into the left. So it gave the background a bit of movement and a bit of a flow, and I really liked that design. So I'm going to try to match what I had done for my practice painting. And for the very first leaf, I start by dipping my dried off paintbrush into the mix, into the wash that I created of that almost like an olive green. It's like a warm muted green. And I touch the tip of it right to where the two petals meet, right up against the color, and very carefully draw it so that I'm not overlapping the petals. And then I add just a dot of the, I believe, the ultramarine blue right where those two petals meet. And that color is creating that wet on wet blending effect that I just love. And then on the second leaf, I created it the same way. Started where two of the petals meet together. I added just a dot of the same red that I made the rose with, the madder rose color. And I put just a dot of that where the two petals meet so that it would bleed wet on wet into the leaf. For the next set of leaves, I started this time the stem of the leaves right where the two petals came together and made a flowy, curvy line where I then attached 3 leaf shapes. The rose leaves have the two that are together, and then the one alone at the top. So I thought that was a fun leaf design to add in there. This time, for a little bit of extra pop for the leaves, a little bit of extra color for that wet on wet beautiful thing that watercolor does, I added just a little bit of that green paint right from the palette. I popped it right in there, and I am very happy with the way that this is bleeding into and adding a little more interest to that color. So for the next swoop of leaves, I again started with the stem and then added a leaf shape onto it, and I very carefully paint along the edge of the petal. And at this point, the petals are pretty dry, especially on the top now. So that's important if you don't want the color of the leaves to blend in with the color of the petals, or the color of the petals blending in with the color of the leaves. You'll want to make sure that the petals are completely dry before you start painting the leaves right next to it. Otherwise, those two colors will intermingle, which I really do like that look as well. It just depends on what you want for your painting, on what kind of look you're going for. So this time I was very cognizant of adding that second color in right away while the leaves were still very wet, so that they would create that wet on wet blending without creating a bloom or like a tidal water line where you can see that edge more clearly. So I put that little bit of color. Again, I just used that same red that I'm using for the rose, just in between those two petals, right where the leaf meets, right where it touches the rose. For the next bit of greenery, I'm going ahead and mixing some of that same green with the ultramarine blue, so that I will have it ready for when I want to add a little bit of a pop of a different color to the green leaves that I will be making next. This way there'll be less of a stark contrast, but still enough contrast that it will be noticeable and you'll be able to see a bit more blue in the green. For the next bit of greenery, I have it going from the left-hand side of the paper, swooping up gradually till it hits the line of the petal, and I'm just careful to stop right on that border between the petal and the paper so that the greenery goes right up to the very edge of the petal. And then I'm creating my little leaves. I'm doing this just to break up the size and type of leaves that I'm using to add a little more interest into the painting. I love looking at the paintings of loose florals where they use all kinds of greenery and it looks like a little bouquet on paper. So I'm really trying to create that here. And while the little leaf shapes are still wet, I'm putting in some of that blue, ultramarine blue and green mixture so that it is flowing nicely and it's not too much of a contrast, but it adds some of the blue-green to add more interest to the leaves. So for the next detail, my inspiration was a painting that I had seen where it looked like little tiny pink flowers on some kind of a branch. So I used the watered down green that I used for the leaves. And then I put a few of the leaves onto the branch, which you want to make sure to start with a thicker line right where it's attached to the rose. And then as you go up the branches, you'll use just the very tip of your brush and make them go thinner as they move away from the rose. And then the little leaves that I'm attaching to it, they're very tiny. They're the smallest leaves yet. And to paint them, I'm using just the very tip of the paintbrush and holding it almost straight up and down. For the flowers that will be attached to the branch, I'm using the same red as the rose and painting in just a few petals to give you the feeling of a flower, but not so many details where you lose that looseness of the painting. And as I am touching the flowers right onto the still wet branches and leaves, some of that pink color is then flowing into that muted green color and giving it that beautiful wet on wet blending effect. Here you can see that I'm using my paintbrush kind of like a sponge to soak up a little bit of extra paint. And to do that, you'll just wipe your paintbrush down on your paper towel or cloth and then go back in and touch the area you want to soak back up, and it works almost like a sponge. For the next piece of this painting, we are mixing a little bit of burnt sienna, which is a very warm, almost reddish golden brown. So you don't have to use burnt sienna, you could use any warm brown that you may have. And I mixed it in with just a little bit of green and then watered it down. I'm starting again right from the petal, and I'm creating short, curvy lines, each one getting smaller than the last. So the thickest of the lines is right where the lines meet the edge of the petal. And then similarly to a tree branch, they are getting thinner and smaller as you go from the rose towards the edge of the paper. To add a little bit of interest or color pop to it, I dip my brush into the same red that I used for the rose, or pink, and I'm adding just a little bits of that pink to it. With this next element to the painting, I'm using that same wash or watered down warm brown and making just little tiny circles, little dots with the tip of the brush. When I am happy with the shape of them, I take my paper towel and I blot them so that the shapes remain and a hint of color remains, but they are now very, very muted. And then as they are still damp, I go in with the pink and I add just little tiny dots, a dot to each one. For the stems for these flowers, I use the same green that I had used for the leaves of the rose. While the stems are still wet, I dab in just a little bit of that mix of the green and the ultramarine blue. And I'm really liking the way that that is mixing together on the paper. And then I'm adding just a little bit of a hint of that green stem up through the top of these tiny flowers. For this next leaf shape, the color that I'm using is a mix between the ultramarine blue and the green that I'm using. It's mostly blue with a little bit of that green and then watered down. The shapes of these leaves are almost round, a bit of an oval shape, and then I'm attaching them to a very thin stem. I believe this is the thinnest stem that I have used so far. And I'm also layering these leaves and the stem over completely dried leaves of the rose. So you want to make sure that anything you are layering on top of is completely dry so that the two colors do not blend into each other. This way, if you have a very watered down, very transparent layer on top of what you've already painted, the bottom layer, the first leaves that you've painted, will be able to show through. I really love layering and playing with the transparent quality of watercolor. Even the more semi-transparent or semi-opaque colors, you're able to layer with them as long as you use the right amount of water to really thin it out. As you can see here, the leaf that I have just painted is blending into the leaf next to it because the leaf next to it was still wet, a little bit wetter than I had thought it was, but the leaf that I'm painting now is going nicely on top of the leaf next to it, as that one was dry enough to paint on top of and not have them blend into it. The petals are completely dry now, as are the leaves that I am painting over right now, so you can see it's just giving you that nice transparent look, and the colors are not bleeding into each other. For this next leaf, I'm using again a combination of the ultramarine blue and the green that I have. It is a darker wash, and I am soaking up a little bit of it with my brush. It soaks up kind of like a sponge, and then adding in just a little bit of that red that we used for the rose to give it a little more interest to the color. For this next flower, I was inspired by kind of the, I don't want to say brain, that's not maybe beautiful to some people, but almost a brain texture of this celosia, where it has all those intricate folds and that really cool texture, really cool detail. So I used that same watered down golden warm brown, and making sure everything underneath it that was going to be underneath it was completely dry. You can use your hair dryer, or if you have one of those handy mini dryers. I used the very tip of my brush and made very thin lines and created kind of a celosia type flower effect. And then with just the golden watered down warm brown, and then added little bits of that pinky red wash to it so that it created this warm pinky golden flower effect. For this next set of leaves, you want to make sure, again, whatever you're painting on top of is completely dry. Maybe get a hair dryer, wait for a while, and then just touch it to make sure that it is bone dry, completely dry. I again am using the watered down combination of mostly ultramarine blue with a little bit of the green, and it is very, very watered down. So it is just a very, very light wash, a light glazing on top. And then the next little flower or little plant that I'm adding start out as these little tiny blue circles. Again, I'm going over paint that is completely bone dry, completely dry, so that this blue is not spreading into that corally pink or the green leaf underneath it. So just like as before when I made those little round circular shapes, I am again making those little round circular shapes, but this time with the mix of the blue-green. I am using that same watered down blue-green and adding just a little bit of more water to it, making sure again everything that I'm painting on top of is extremely dry, and I'm making a longer, thinner, larger leaf shape and making it in that very pale, very watered down, soft blue-green. And then just a touch of the pink right at the base where it attaches to the rose in between the two petals, which creates a light violet. To keep the painting, the composition looking balanced, I thought it needed a little bit of that blue-green in the bottom right-hand corner as well, so I went ahead and added some more of those little blue circles. Then towards the top, because the coral looking plant was dried already and so was the leaf, I went ahead and added in kind of like a densely branching sedum or something with a seed pod I was thinking of, and added those in, making sure to have the branches getting smaller towards the top and thicker towards the bottom, and adding just a little bit of more intense color here and there, just dropping it in. It was still very wet, so it bled in nicely together. It had that nice wet on wet blending. Once those little tiny blue circular flowers or seed pods maybe at the bottom right hand corner are dry, I'm going in and placing just a tiny little dot towards the top of each of them with that warm, very diluted brown color, and then adding in for their stem that same color, very diluted, starting right from the edge of the petal of the rose and going up into the little flowers or seed pods, however you want to think of them, and then adding just a little hint of it towards the very bottom of the paper. And dabbing in just a little bit extra color towards the very base and a little bit towards the top of the brown. Then I am taking that same color and adding a similar width of a stem to the top right hand corner, and then deciding where else I want to put them to keep the flow, to keep that feeling of the painting. And I decide to put another one right at the top of the rose, on top of the leaf there that is, again, it's completely dry. For the flowers to go along with this stem, I decide on just teeny tiny little dots of color. So I use the same color, which is that watered down, like warm brown. And I'm just very lightly pressing the very teeny tiny tip of the paintbrush against the paper and leaving almost just like a texture, just like a hint of a flower behind. I was thinking maybe dried seed pods or maybe a dried sedum, and just leaving a hint of that. After the painting has completely dried, I am removing the tape. It's coming off very well, and I am thrilled with this painting. It was so much fun to do. Thank you so much for joining me painting today. I hope that you get the chance to sit down with your paints and create something. Maybe play with the transparencies or the loose watercolor or the wet on wet mixing. I had so much fun doing it myself that I created a second one done in a very similar way using the same techniques. So now I have a sister painting and I'm going to be hanging them up together at my house. I'm pretty pleased with that. I hope that you enjoyed watching this painting video, that you're able to try out some of the techniques that we've done today, and I'll see you next time.